Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Academy podcast, the podcast dedicated to simplifying the commercial real estate industry for the masses. Each week, we sit down with industry experts to dissect the many facets of commercial real estate and extract valuable lessons you can apply to your business. Whether you're a new or seasoned business owner or investor, the Commercial Real Estate Academy podcast will be your go-to resource for all your commercial real estate needs. Now, here are your hosts, Raphael Collazo and Jeff Walston.
Welcome to the Commercial Real Estate Academy podcast. I'm your host, Raphael Collazo, here with my co-host, Jeff Walston. How's it going, my friend?
It's going great. I'm grateful for actually this rainy day that we got here. It's been weeks without rain, and we definitely needed it. So.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's been somewhat warm and humid over the last several weeks. So I believe this weekend it's supposed to be a little bit cooler, which will be nice. You know, be able to get outside and enjoy some of the cooler weather.
Absolutely. And speaking of cool, the new podcast we have coming up, Seth Blann, who is an agent for Carr CRE. They are a real estate firm who specializes in healthcare professionals, specifically in the buyer representation and tenants of doctors and dentists. In today's podcast, we're going to go over through a specific deal that he actually went through on his first deal, actually, and the financing benefits that some banks and industries can and cannot do on these particular deals. A lot of people don't know about that, it's particularly the clients that he represents, and also some of the things that they commonly overlook in potential properties. And he goes on to talk about himself and how he got into the dental realm, which is a neat story. So I'm excited for everyone to hear. And do you, Raphael, have anything to add to that?
No, yeah. I mean, it was a really interesting podcast because I don't have a ton of experience in the dental and medical space. I mean, I've working with right now a veterinarian, and you know, I've had discussions with people in the medical space, but it is definitely an industry that has a lot of different moving parts and nuances that a lot of people don't consider. And in particular, when you're thinking about dentists and medical professionals, they go to school to really refine their craft of being a dentist or a doctor or a surgeon or whatever, and they don't typically think about the business side of things and really the real estate component within their practice. And so Seth shared a lot of great insights on what these types of professionals need to consider when they're looking to acquire or lease these types of buildings, because there's equipment costs to consider. There's the acquisition of the real estate. There's build out costs. I mean, you name it, there's a ton of things that you need to consider. And so throughout this podcast, we really highlighted some of those main obstacles that those professionals face and how to effectively navigate those obstacles to eventually have a successful practice long term. And so I thought it was an awesome episode. I know Jeff and I really appreciated discussing these types of concepts with Seth. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right into this episode. Hey, Seth, how's it going? Great seeing you this fine morning.
Yeah, man, it's going great. Thanks for having me. Thanks to you and Jeff for both reaching out. I'm happy to be here today with you guys.
Oh, of course. Yeah. When Jeff mentioned that, your specialization and everything, I definitely was interested in learning a little bit more about it. And I know the audience today is probably going to be interested in what you have to say as well. So definitely welcome to the podcast. So Jeff and I kind of know a little bit about your background, but if you could share with the listeners really what got you interested going down the path that you're on right now.
Yeah. So I'm originally from Bowling Green, Kentucky, born and raised, played college golf, pursued a professional career in that for a couple of years, and moved back home to Bowling Green to look for a real job, I like to say. And I fell into the dental industry, and I worked for Henry Schein for 5 years. So that's actually how Carr, which is my current company, found me, because they're a commercial real estate company that only does healthcare, and 60% of our annual revenue comes from the dental industry. So they don't necessarily care if you have any commercial real estate experience, but having that dental or medical industry experience is really what they're looking for. Luckily, my brother and I have some residential property on the side. Obviously, it's very, very different than commercial, but I did have a little bit of real estate experience coming into this as well. So there was a win-win for me, being both still in the dental industry and real estate. So
yeah, I know for sure. And I've interacted with different doctors and dentists and various other medical professionals in the past, and they have different terminology. They have different things they look out for. So it is definitely a unique specialization that, it's kind of interesting. And I'm excited to kind of dive into, what insights you've had just through the experiences you've had with that brokerage. So
yeah, absolutely.
I know you said you dove into an experience with residential real estate. What made you want to do the commercial route? What intrigued you on that, or was it just the dental, or can you elaborate on?
Yeah, so like most industries, the dental industry is small, and I had a couple of friends make the jump from whether that was Henry Schein or a competitor over to Carr, and it was perfect timing, Jeff. So I was actually taking my real estate license exam just to have it for my brother and my sake, and I got a call from Carr and a referral from somebody that was already working there, and it was just good timing for me all around to make a career change.
We've talked about this several times on the podcast. It's
Yes.
residential real estate. You can approach a brokerage and just kind of hang your license and you're ready to go. Whereas with the commercial real estate business, it's relationship based. You could try a long time to try to get into the business, but unless you know someone who can vouch for you and really loop you into the business, it's a lot more difficult, in my opinion, to be able to break into it. I jumped in from a software background. I was an engineer and then got into the business through just a relationship I had with a residential agent who just so happened to do with the deal with my broker. And so, made the introduction, sat down, kind of had, we had coffee, and I met several people in the organization, and then they finally said, "Hey, this seems to be a good fit." But had I not had that one relationship with that individual that introduced me to my broker, realistically, I probably wouldn't have been where I'm at right now. So that kind of lends itself to the importance of developing those relationships within your industry. So that's awesome.
I had a couple different roles at Henry Schein, and that's basically where I started with all of my, vendor meetings were dental reps, equipment reps, and then obviously, end lenders, CPAs, and various other people. So that the web grew quickly, but I'm glad I had a place to start. But sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's kind of leads me to my next question, which is with Carr, as you mentioned. Is there a reason why you guys decided to specialize in the medical space, in particular in the dental space? And along with that, do you guys do leasing, or is it primarily just acquisition of these types of medical properties?
Yeah, good question. I'll try to unpack that one for you. So our CEO was with Colliers for 10 or 12 years. So it's, big firm, very, a lot of people know Colliers, and they typically represent landlords. And he came across various deals where he was working with a dentist or a veterinarian or some other healthcare practitioner, and they typically did not do very well on their real estate transactions. They were typically in the landlord's favor. So he had this idea to go out and start a healthcare only, tenant buyer only commercial real estate firm. And dental being still very, very much private practice, small business, there's a lot of dentists out there, especially as it pertains to where we're at in the state of Kentucky. There's 2 dental schools in the state, which doesn't necessarily make sense. And it shows why Bowling Green, Lexington, and Louisville are so saturated with dentists. But that's really where the idea came from. Was our CEO saw an opportunity that I guess not many other people have seen in the healthcare industry. And he really eliminated that conflict of interest that sometimes can arise where, an agent can be representing both the landlord and the doctor, but usually one party gets a better deal than the other. So that's kind of where it came about.
Yeah, no, the concept of dual agency is definitely a tricky one to navigate. And I know here in Kentucky, you can operate as a dual agent. I know other states, for example, in Arizona, I don't think you can do it. My mother's a real estate agent there. But it's interesting. And I think that I've dealt with business owners in particular on that side. And there's a lot of things that if you're not actively engaged into that industry, that you can overlook as you're going through the process of acquiring, a dental lab or, some sort of other medical facility. So it's great to see that you guys are specializing in that area.
Yeah, there's so much more that goes into it. And I know you've probably got other questions, but just in regard to HVAC and electrical specs and, square footage they actually need to be looking at. Even the doctors a lot of times don't know, I'm looking at 6 operatories. I need to be looking at this much square footage, and they don't necessarily know that either. So
that kind of actually brings me into another question. What are some of the common items that were overlooked in the analyzing potential spaces for the dentists? Like for you, there's some things that they may or may not have overlooked or that you've helped them with and guided them through the process.
Well, I think like most small business owners, they're very conscious of overhead, but they're not necessarily as conscious of productivity and growth. You have to be cognizant of both. You need to have overhead where it needs to be, but you also need to plan for future growth and how long can I stay here? So one of the things that I typically see is they never have enough storage. once you get to about 6 operatories, you need to consider, 600 square feet per op as opposed to 500 square feet per op. You need more storage, you need a bigger break room, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the things I typically see is they cut themselves short in regard to square footage. And then I guess the other thing is just not knowing what they need to know. A lot of times the landlord will put in an HVAC unit or an electrical service at their costs. Typically that's going to stay. They're not going to take that with them. So, and just knowing what those specs need to be can save the doctor a lot of money on the front end, but also, dentists move once every 15 to 20 years. So it can get a landlord or a great long-term tenant. So,
I mean, for a landlord, getting someone like that in that industry, it's a huge benefit to their building. So that's something I know that they're looking for sure, but I'm sure there's a huge investment on both sides to getting that set up and started. But once you're there, that's definitely a long-term lease. And yeah.
And I'll even say on the equipment side too. I mean, it's extremely expensive to build out a medical office. It's kind of mind-boggling to me sometimes when I analyze several opportunities and I'm like, wow, I mean, it really does take a lot to be able to get, a dentist office, or especially if you're talking about like a physician that does any type of surgery, that has specialized equipment. I mean, that equipment can be extremely expensive. And maybe you could talk a little bit about, your experience in that sales role when you were, working with dentists. What are some of the, I guess, misconceptions they had about, the equipment that they needed to consider? Because I mean, again, you go to medical school or you go to dental school, and that's what you're going to be focusing on. You're not necessarily thinking about the business side of things. You're not necessarily thinking about, what it's going to cost me to get into private practice. If you could talk to a little bit about that, I think it would be beneficial for the audience.
So I think it's just kind of a misconception on all parties, even more so the doctor. So, one scenario I see a lot, even during COVID, which kind of speaks to the industry, was a lot of startups. But that loan amount is typically finite. I mean, doctors are going to come out of school with $300,000 worth of debt, typically going to have a house, a couple cars, very common. Most banks don't know necessarily how to loan on that. And there are a handful of local banks and then obviously national banks that can do that. But to your question, what gets squeezed typically in that loan is the equipment, which is very important to get into the office, because the more equipment they can put in earlier, the more productivity they have earlier. So it's important for the landlord to know, okay, they may be a negative millionaire on paper, but as an industry as a whole, they have less than 1% default rate. They move once every 15 years. And I need to help them on the front end in regard to the build out allowance. So those loans are broken down: construction, equipment, and working capital. And equipment typically is what squeezes the last. So doctors don't necessarily know how those loans are broken down and what they need to be asking for from the landlord. And the landlord doesn't necessarily understand, why do I need to give somebody that may have a negative net worth or maybe not worth much at all on paper, $100,000 or $150,000 build out allowance? But it's just kind of explaining to both parties why this makes sense and how we need to make it work within those loan parameters. So there's a lot of different ways we can talk about that in regard to acquisition or second location, but I think the startup loan is pretty easy to unpack, and that's what I've seen a lot of.
Yeah. And do you see people typically go for the lease as opposed to acquiring the building and then building it out? Or I guess does it depend on where they're at in their career, or could you share a little bit on that?
Yeah, great question. So it typically depends on where they're at in their career. Most banks are not going to loan on a practice and the real estate. So typically you'll see them buying a building maybe 10 or 15 years after they've started their practice, because again, they just don't have the financial fortitude to do that at the start. Unless they are doing an acquisition, you will see that sometimes. So if they've got cash flow from the start, banks will loan on those last 3 years collections. And if the real estate makes sense too, a lot of times that cash flow will allow the bank to lend on the real estate too.
So if you could walk us through maybe the first dental deal you did on the commercial front, that may be helpful, just to kind of give us an idea of what that looked like.
Yeah, that was a great one. So it was actually a lease renewal for a specialty dental office in Lexington, Kentucky. So lease renewals, we love lease renewals. Most brokerage firms do not, because they're hard to get paid on, but they're actually the number one real estate transaction that happen every year. And most of the time they go unnoticed because many times the doctors don't know when their lease is going to actually end. When they sign a 5 or 10 year lease, it just catches up to them. So my first deal was a lease renewal. The doctor had ran out of space. He was in about 2,100 square feet. We had fully negotiated, I think, 2 other properties for 10-year terms, and COVID hit. So I started January of 2020. Due to COVID, he said, I don't want to move. I'm unsure what's going to happen with COVID, but his option was to sign another 5-year lease. And he's like, I don't necessarily want to be here for another 5 years because I've already outgrown the space. So his rental rate was jumping from $1,750 to $2,150, which was pretty substantial in regard to his overhead. And we actually got him a 2-year term, and the rental rate down to $1,850. And I believe that escalated maybe 2% in the second year, but it saved him $10,000 or $11,000. He wasn't stuck in a space for 5 years that he'd already outgrown. So here in about a year, he's going to be prepared to move into something bigger, probably.
And that just goes to show the value of getting someone like you involved in the process, because I guarantee you that if you hadn't come in, I'm assuming he would have been forced to do something because he wouldn't have known that there were other options out there. He probably wouldn't have understood what the market dynamics were at the time. And that's why I think there's so much value in having people who have that experience, who have that market expertise to be able to advise you, because you're right. I mean, who knows in the next year, if let's say he signed the deal, a year or two ago, now he has more time to prepare. And so now it's like, okay, I can start the process of identifying a new property, whether that's me buying a new building or maybe approaching different landlords in the area to do some sort of lease, long-term lease with a potential build out, and so strategically from a business standpoint, it makes complete sense. And so that's interesting to hear you say that.
Yeah, a lot of lease renewals and a lot of startups in the last couple of years for me, but that was a great first deal to work on.
Earlier, you were talking about financing and how equipment and construction and going into details. What are the options for people that are medical professionals, acquiring commercial property or, for their tenant build out and such? Where can they go? And you were talking about there was less banks and such to do that, but who do you recommend and where can they go and get something started for people that may have want to get started in this?
Yeah, I love to work with local banks if possible. And again, it's just hard a lot of times for them to understand the strength of the industry and how those loans need to look. But there's a bank down here in Bowling Green called First Southern National Bank. They're actually considered a community bank, but they have business in 30 of our 50 states. They just did a deal in Hawaii for a veterinarian, and they love healthcare. German American in the Louisville market does great. They also do well in the Lexington market. Stockyards does great in the Louisville market, and they have a pretty wide span across the state as well. And there's various other banks that do really well with acquisitions. U.S. Bank does well with acquisitions. And then from a national standpoint, your typical Bank of America, Hunting, and Wells Fargo, they are known for the startup loans. They actively have teams that chase dentists, veterinarians, and typically optometrists are usually the top 3. And then, some of the medical professions as well. It's been great learning more about financing and from a local and a national level. A lot of the local banks will take what the bigger banks have done, and then people like First Southern National Bank are willing to lend more on people as opposed to a balance sheet. They're not checking as many boxes as a Bank of America is. So it's nice to have options in both arenas. Did I answer your question, Jeff?
Yeah, I believe so. And that gives listeners and viewers kind of some things to go off of to see where they can actually get the financing necessary. Actually, I think Raphael and I have a client that we've been trying to help out together, and I think she will find benefits of what you said when she watches and listens to this. So, yeah,
and I'm kind of curious because a lot of times when I'm dealing with clients, depending on what they're open to as far as a down payment is concerned, that's sometimes I'll encourage them to check out the SBA option through, someone like a U.S. Bank or some other type of national lender. But for the financing options specifically for dental uses or medical uses, are there anything in particular? Do they have like lower down payments? Do they have longer, amortizations, or how are the interest rates look like? Is it pretty typical to what you would see with like me? Let's say I'm representing some sort of, restaurant use or, some other industrial business owner that wants to acquire like a large warehouse. Are there different types of loans that are available just specifically for the medical use?
Yeah, I can't necessarily speak to those other industries, but I can tell you a little bit about definitely the healthcare industry. So in regard to practice loans, most banks will go out to 10 years, and then some of them will even stretch that amortization out to 15 years, which makes the cash flow look really nice. In regard to loaning on those practice acquisitions, They'll typically take the 75 to 90% average. The average of the last 3 years collections. They'll loan up to 75 or 90% of those on the practice. So if you've got a practice collecting $1 million, you're looking at a $750,000 to $900,000 loan stretched out over 10 or 15 years. In regard to the startup loan, you typically see it between 500 and maybe 600 for a general dentist or a veterinarian. And then for specialists, you'll see them go up to 650 a lot. And typically the first 12 or 18 months is interest only. The next 18 months is partial payment. And then I think in year 3, typically, or right around 36 months, they'll be, making a full payment, principal and interest. So it really allows them to get their patients in the door, get some cash flow going, especially if they're a startup. So I'm trying to think those startup loans again will be, 10 or 15 years. So
yeah, and that would make sense too, because I'm assuming you also can include equipment costs and other things that aren't necessarily just the acquisition of the real estate within that loan.
Yes. So a lot of times they'll consider build out new equipment and things like that. Yeah, working capital, whatever it may be. So as it pertains to that startup loan, they're usually planning for about $300,000 in regard to construction, $125,000 or $150,000 in regard to equipment, and then $75,000 or $100,000 of working capital.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's typically what I've seen on the acquisition side for, let's say an SBA loan where, if you're going to be acquiring a business, the amortization period is going to be a little bit more contracted. And that's because of the fact sometimes you're buying, the actual inventory, the business itself, you're factoring in some working capital. And so typically banks like to shorten the amortization periods on those. And then obviously if you're just acquiring the real estate, they can be a little bit more flexible since it is a hard asset.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've been in the business now for a little while, especially in the dental industry, you've been in for a little while. I guess if you were to go back and talk to your younger self about, what exactly you wish you would have known back then, what would you tell yourself? And, what advice would you give yourself so that you could really just stretch your growth over the next 5 or 6 years?
Man, that's a great question. The first thing that comes to my mind, especially being at Carr for the last 2 years, is I had 2 different roles when I was at Henry Schein. First, I was a territory rep, so the doctors would see me every couple of weeks. I was the main point of contact, and I'd sell them their basic supplies, their consumables, and their equipment. So I actually wondered how many new offices, whether that's a startup or an additional location or expansion, that I missed out on because I didn't necessarily understand financing as it pertains to dental or overhead in a dental office. Just like dentists, they come out of school with very little business acumen. I feel like I could have found more deals for myself and for the doctor if I understood things like I'm doing now in regard to the real estate and the practice and their overhead. So
that's a great advice for yourself, to if you were to go back and say that would be hugely beneficial, because I mean you're utilizing those skills now and look where you're skyrocketing in your career and stuff, and it shows. So
yeah, and really developing business acumen, because as brokers and as real estate professionals, you're a resource to these individuals. And like you said, I mean, typically dentists and medical professionals and really any type of business owner, they know their business, but they may or may not know how real estate can impact their business either positively or negatively. So being able to be that kind of go-to resource for those individuals and really showing that you understand their business very well, not only can make sure that you set them up for success, but really that helps you with long-term growth, because everyone talks, right? You say the dental industry is a small industry, and the medical industry likewise. So it's like one of those things where if you help enough people and you show that you're excellent at what you do, people talk. So that's some great advice to share.
It's so funny, man. I would get a lead on a new office or an expansion or whatever it may be, and I'd say, talk to our equipment and our office design representative. Instead, I could have been saying, hey, I would talk to your lender and you have a contractor that's done dental before, and kind of start circling the team around the doctor and kind of helps them push forward. But first and foremost, it allows them to know if they can even do what they want to do from the start. If they talk to a lender and they say, this isn't really what you need to be doing right now, maybe this is a project you do in 2 years. It really eliminates a lot of people wasting time as well that they shouldn't have done. So, yeah.
Yeah, great advice. Another question that we like to ask our guests is, if you were to choose the most impactful book that you read in your life, maybe something recently or even something that you read 10 years ago. It can be from any year, but maybe something that you read and that started you on your life path now. So is there anything that stands out for you?
I guess one that I have recently read is Think and Grow Rich. And there's one thing that has stuck out to me as it pertains to this career that I just took 2 years ago. It basically said, if you want to do really well at something, it's essentially like going to war on a ship, hopping off on the land and burning your ships. So just that mindset in general that I pulled from that book I think has helped me in having a fast start, because, I left a comfortable job at Henry Schein. And, as Raphael knows, you jump into commercial real estate where it's, commission based and you eat what you kill. That's really how it is. So just taking that mindset from it in general, and then really just having a plan. I think a lot of people try to dive too deep in general, but I think having a simple plan, I think the simple things make people successful, whether that's just getting up and being consistent every day, but having a plan and following it. So like most people, I try to line my year out, January 1 and try to stick to that the best I can. So those two things, having a plan, whether that's a business plan or just a yearly plan, and then having a good mindset. So,
yeah. And commercial real estate's a long-term business, right? Usually people wash out in their first year because they have this expectation that they're going to be able to get into it and start making massive amounts of money where, that could theoretically happen, but in reality, it's probably not. And it's probably going to take you a long time to get to where you want to be. But having that long-term mindset, and like you said, burning the ship at the shore, is really the mindset you have to have. You got to say, look, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep going until I can achieve whatever goal that I want to achieve. And then, like you said, tracking your progress over time kind of helps you with that, because, it's very easy to get disheartened with the fact that you're putting in so much effort and you don't really see the fruits of your labor. But if you're actively tracking your progress, you start saying, oh yeah, actually, where I was last, quarter, I've actually improved this quarter. And so it shows that progress. So psychologically, it helps you immensely as well. So yeah, the Think and Grow Rich is one that several people recommended on the podcast. And I agree. I think it's one of the best books that you can read, in particular from a mindset perspective.
Yes.
Well, first off, I just want to really thank you for stopping by the podcast. Again, you provided some great insights. Now, one of the things that we usually ask our guests to provide at the end of the podcast is a contribution to the CRE treasure chest. Essentially what this is it's a repository of resources that we make available to our podcast listeners to learn about the many facets of commercial real estate. And it can be either a helpful PDF or some sort of Excel spreadsheet. We've had people give due diligence checklists or really whatever else. So what are you willing to contribute to the treasure chest today?
Yeah, we've got 25 or 30 articles, Raphael, that we have that's really beneficial to any healthcare practitioner. If they wanted if they listen to your podcast and wanted to go see what you all had available, I think I could probably send you 2 or 3 good articles that would have great information for them on what to look out for, whether that's purchasing or leasing. So
that's awesome, man.
Yeah,
I know that would help a ton of people because, explaining the leasing process and the purchasing process, in particular to someone in the dental space or the medical space, can be somewhat challenging, in particular if you don't specialize in it. So having the perspective of a company that really, that's all they do, I think that would be extremely helpful. And I know several people that I would love to send that article to, because it could definitely help them in their pursuit of what they're trying to do. So
yeah,
awesome.
We really appreciate you coming on. I know we've had meetings before and stuff like that. You're a heck of a guy. And I know other people are going to want to reach out to you for sure. So which way can they contact you if they're wanting to get into the healthcare industry, particularly dentists and whatnot? Which way would you like them to reach out to you?
So they can actually go to our website, www.carr.us. And I think in the top right corner, it says find an agent, and I'm the only agent in Kentucky. So I'll have a picture pop up with my name, phone number, and email address. So they can reach me at any way they want.
Perfect.
Yeah. And for those of you guys who are listening or watching this on YouTube, we will include it in the show notes. So you guys can go ahead and click in the description and go to the link and be able to contact Seth if you guys are interested in potentially acquiring or leasing some sort of either dental or medical office space. So perfect. Well, thank you so much, Seth. It was great talking to you. For those of you guys who are listening on Apple Podcasts, we would really appreciate it if you could drop a 5-star review and leave a comment. It really helps with the algorithm and make sure more and more people can hear the message. Same goes for YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm and ensures more and more people can hear this message. So thanks again for stopping by, and we'll see you all next week.